All right. We should be live for our latest episode of the Roguelike Game Design Roundtable. It's another episode of the Game Dev Roundtable series. Hope everyone is having a great night. This time I made sure to make sure we are live before we actually start talking so that we can actually have our audience. But we have another topic lined up for our panel this episode. Unfortunately, Josh from Vol of the Void couldn't make it. We had, once again, the nastiness of time zone to get in the way of that, but we will hopefully get him on for a future episode. So, our topic for this one is going to be RNG. Specifically, is how much or how little is good when it comes to RNG, or how much should RNG factor in, which is something that's very important for roguelikes, roguelites, and so on. So, before we get to the topic, as always, I will give our roundtable a chance to introduce themselves. So I'll start with me and we'll go once again clockwise around. I am Josh Blazer, the owner right here of Game Wisdom, where we talk about game design and industry topics. I wrote a book on roguelike design, and I just released my latest book on free-to-play and mobile design as of this day. So be sure to check all that out, and I'll throw over to Tomo.
Hi guys, my name is Tomo Moriwaki. I've been a game designer for quite a long time, somewhere more than 2 decades and somewhat less than 3. And I am a creative director at a small dev studio called Hyperkinetic Studios. And we have one game on Steam Early Access. It's been there too long, but it's all about storytelling and fantasy characters. And I'm happy to be here.
All right. And to Seth.
Hey, I'm Seth Goldberg. I'm a game developer slash reviewer slash person that helps out with discovery slash, it's like at that convention where you've got the one panelist sitting up front with all the cards. Yeah. Glad to be here, and hopefully we'll talk about some random stuff.
Hey, I'm Simon Boxer. I run a small indie studio called Twice Different from Australia, and our first game was Ring of Pain, which is out, and we've been updating that since launch, and that's a roguelike card crawler sort of thing. And we're in the process of prototyping more and building towards our next project. So it's a pleasure to be here and talking roguelikes again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we got a very interesting one, because I'm sure no one here on this panel or has watched has ever had bad RNG happen in any kind of game. We've hit every chance, whether it's a 10% chance or a 99% chance. No one on this panel has ever missed a 99% success rate in a game before. No one, I'm sure. But RNG has been one of the major aspects, especially again when it comes to roguelikes in particular. The idea, of course, is that you never know what you're going to get in a run, and that can have a not so big, I'm sure, effect on the experience. And it's also one of the hardest things, I think, to kind of teach the consumer about. Because as we all know, if something has a 50% chance of happening, that means in 2 chances, it's got to happen at least one of those times, right? That's just basic math. And no one has ever decried a roguelike, saying, I can't get all my hits missed, the game is cheating, and, RNG is wrong. And there is certainly a lot that we can go with, or to start off for our topic. So, I guess my question for the round, or for the group here, then, to start off with, when do you think, how much should RNG be a factor? Because again, when it comes to roguelikes, they are inherently built on replayability, randomization, procedural design. But how much should the roll of the dice really control, the consumer's experience over the play? And whoever wants to start off, feel free.
I think it's very important for roguelikes. Well, actually, I mean, it's interesting the scale of deterministic games too, ones that include a lot more chance. Because if it's fully deterministic, then it's just a puzzle game, really, unless it can't be solved, in which case it's unfair. But yeah, I think RNG is very important because it adds tension to a game in a lot of ways, and it also can bridge the gap of skills as well. It can make a game more accommodating to more casual players if it's done in a way that, you know, services that intentionally, and there are ways to do that behind the scenes as well to help sort of do smart RNG that's sort of like ramping in chance to give people more of the experience that they expect, as opposed to, you know, what you're talking about, losing multiple coin flips in a row but expecting that you should win one every two.
So, you know, I think that it's important. There's some aspects to the question: how much should a certain genre have in terms of its randomness and its die rolls? I think if you kind of explored the concept of randomness in general in gameplay, you know, obviously if I have kind of like a flat distribution of 100 possibilities, it's really hard for my brain to kind of draw any meaning from that die roll or that set of possible results. So embarking on that one of 100 different possibilities option isn't very clear to me. It doesn't feel good. And I can't, and maybe once in a while I get good results. Even if they were all good results, there's something sort of impossible to enjoy in that kind of case. So that's like an extreme case. Let's say there's a 50% chance of something good happening and a 50% chance of something bad happening. You know, now it's at least fairly clear what's going to happen. And in those situations, you know, most of the time players aren't going to really have a problem with getting a bad result half the time, especially when it's very clear to them. The problem starts to come into play, though, if I get the bad result, let's say 8 times in a row. And my brain knows that chances of that happening aren't very high. But if I don't really know much about probabilities, at some point I can start doubting the machine. And it's that doubt where the problems arise. If there was none of that problem, then you could simply explore randomization in terms of, I would like the player to imagine that these set of things could occur, and these are the probabilities between them, and then here we go. This is the sort of pact you're accepting with the developer when you roll that die, and then you take the results. The psychological factors are overwhelming, and so in some ways, I feel like the right amount of randomization sort of is highly dependent on what you want to have happen. And I think that for a lot of players especially, and to some extent developers, there's this mistake that the frustration of not getting what you want in a random roll is a fundamentally bad thing. And so tuning that to the right proportion of the experience is kind of can become a complicated conversation.
People remember frustration more so than they do happy moments. And the bad rolls stand out. We all remember that 99% shot we missed in XCOM and your team wiped because of that. We all remember that sword we picked up that when we finally identified it, that we thought it was the best thing in the world, it turned into be crap. The human brain just that's how it works. And it's unfortunate, and you have to really balance around it. You know, it's fairly often that I've been in meetings where we've been looking at, all right, is the RNG generator borked, or people don't have enough sample sizes to really say whether they're seeing anomalies. We're, by this point we can pretty much say that the XCOM random number generator is not tuned properly. Or at least it's not tuned randomly, and there may be some impact to how well you're doing that gets thrown in there, and that's not exactly a bad system. If you're having just the horrible run, tweaking the numbers a little bit in your favor when it checks to see what the next thing is gonna come up, that's not necessarily a bad thing to be done behind the scenes. to elongate the run. And then there are people that are purists that'll tell you, it has to be absolutely right, 100% random.
Both those extremes are very hard to believe.
Yeah, and like as someone who's been playing a lot of like the mobile games and the gacha style games, like RNG is certainly a huge aspect of those games. I mean, there are people who, again, they will spend hundreds and thousands of dollars on that 2% or even 0.75% chance for that rare roll. And like to what Seth said, like we remember the best and we remember the worst because those things that stick out. And the challenge, I think, for a lot of games is that idea of how much should you have to rely on the best rolls. I think one of the more like brilliant things when we saw kind of the evolution from deck builders with like Slay the Spire and Monster Train was this idea of kind of limiting the RNG to some respect to the different classes. So if I'm playing as the Ironclad or the Silent, I know when I beat a level or beat a match, I'm going to get Ironclad or Silent cards, and you have, I think, a little bit more control over kind of how you're going to progress, because it's a different story between saying, okay, you win, take this card, you have no control, versus you win, here's 3 cards from the shuffle, pick one of these 3.
I have a question actually that relates to our game and a problem that I've been thinking about with RNG. So in Ring of Pain, you can stealth past a card, and if you fail the stealth roll, you get hit by that card. If you succeed, you successfully stealth. But the player starts with really low stealth chance, and some people, even a few reviewers, are very hesitant to use stealth because the chance is so low. So I guess I would be interested in your perspectives on like what would you do to mitigate that, or would you approach it in a different way?
I think that brings up the topic of granularity in the context of randomized results. If for example, like the stealth roll is going to occur and I like have like a 15% chance of succeeding, then, and that's the only result, I can either succeed or fail and add 50% chance of that success. It's so much of the result table looks like a failure that it doesn't feel like it's worth it, right? And so I can't ever start, right? I can't develop a relationship with that action because I don't start. It's not clear what the answer would be, with so little information, but creating an environment or conditions under which I can, kind of flip those odds and have a very high chance of success for something, maybe even that is totally cosmetic, might be a possible solution. And that what I like about that is it's a suggestion that doesn't change anything. It's just it's just an experiential band-aid to kind of draw people into usage, and then once usage has occurred, then you can kind of start expecting less complaints, right? Because complaints happen less when players understand more.
Yeah, I think maybe it was partly mitigated by the game being called Ring of Pain, so they expect to be failing a lot.
Yeah, and once players are used to losing a lot, it's like all the complaints go out the window. Right? It just
well, it's built into the balance as well. It's just interesting that for some players, it actually blocks their willingness to try it and learn that is how you will succeed, even though it feels like failing in the small moments.
Yeah, and I think you want to go first, Seth?
I was going to say, in Ring of Pain, I think the only real answer is to stealth your way through. I play it as if I was playing Thief, not a roguelike.
So I think for me, like, the challenge, I think this goes to, like, Tomo's point, that if the only 2 options are succeed 100% or fail 100%, I think that kind of conditions the player that if the punishment is so weighted that, if I fail, this enemy just immediately smacks me, or in other roguelikes, you drink the bad potion, your character dies, or he, catches poisons or diseases and so on, it conditions the player not to even risk it, because if that failure is so huge, there's just no, the reward doesn't seem like it's worth it. For me, when I play something with FTL, when you had some of those choices where if you don't get the blue or superior option, and you get something like, oh, crew member just dies, all of a sudden you just lost your best crew member, you're going to be like, well, if the absolute worst thing just completely destroys my run, I'm never going to do this again, because, there's always that thought in the back of my mind of, yes, I could risk this for maybe a 10% reward, or 90% I get a run killer, see you later. I think some games maybe can get away with it either by having maybe an in-between option. So let's say you have the 10% chance to succeed, you have a high chance of failing, and maybe you have another chance that, let's say, nothing happens. The whole thing just, it doesn't go through, you don't get attacked, but you don't get, the stealth pass as well. And the player can then take that risk of, well, nothing happened this time, what if I do it again? And maybe this time I get the success, or this time, the guy actually hits me. So there's that sense that it's not, all peaches and roses, or, plague and death. There's some kind of middle way that's a little bit, good and bad.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I think another way to think about it too is, oh God, I was watching a science video about Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and just the only comment I have about that is that there is no magical uncertainty in the universe, at least not in that theory, right? It's not that because I looked at how tall this is, I can never know how fat it is. That's not exactly what's happening. But what is happening is that if a player was almost forced to use a long odds option many times without maybe a threat of larger negative consequences, then they start to kind of recognize the right conditions under which it could be used, right? By really seeing that, because to really you take a 10% chance of something happening, I would say a player would kind of need to do that roughly 20 times to have sort of some confidence where to place that action, right? And until they've done it 20 times, they're going to have a lot of hesitation. Now you can overcome that hesitation, one by saying there's no consequences to trying, and the other would be to go, you have no other choice. And both of those, so if you kind of think of this difficulty to adopt bubble, that you can start bracketing in with, you got no choice, you have no consequences, you have many samples to start to, acquaint yourself with its functionality.
Yeah.
We're definitely in the you have no other choice camp.
And I think that goes with what Thousand Moon said in chat. High risk stuff can be nice when your run isn't going that great. And they brought up the pills example in the Binding of Isaac. And the pills in Binding of Isaac are just the roguelike analog of a potion. Drink the potion, it could, fill your health back up. It could lower your strength. It could give you increased speed, give you invulnerability. You just don't know for that run. And I think when you have those very high risk options, I think there's always going to be two conditions where the player is going to feel yeah, I'll roll the dice. One is when the run is going so good that nothing bad could ruin it. Oh no, I take 1 point of damage, I have, 20 other points of health, who cares? Or to what Simon and Tomo were talking about, when there is no other option. When, okay, I have 1 point of health left, there's a boss in this next room, I have this mysterious pill bottle, what's going to happen? Maybe I'll get all my health back, or maybe it'll be an additional poison, I just die right there. We just don't know.
I love that idea too, where it's just like, oh, you're dead, and that moment. And since you felt like there weren't many options to you, that can be kind of a joyful moment. But not everybody has that sensibility. I get that.
Yeah. And when we have our talk about how like roguelikes become like more mainstream or adopting roguelike elements, we're going to have to come back to that point of like trying to introduce, normal people to the idea that yes, you can fail that 80% chance. It's not guaranteed.
People seem to not like that though, in normal games. In rogues, we always say, okay, we know that we're going to be dealing with this high streaky randomization where, if you sit down and you play a strategy game, as we've talked about a million times, most people don't like losing, especially if it's to just something random. I would imagine that would be the same thing in an FPS. Although I'm interested to see how Death Wish is that the name of the rogue FPS where it's short runs and you're trying to escape out of a time loop?
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's called Death Loop, I think.
Death Loop, yeah. I'm interested to see how people handle, that just micro run theory. Not theory, but gameplay.
I think we need to make one comment real quick, though, is that however much rage we feel about XCOM's RNG, I think we can safely say that it worked for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. People eat that crap up in XCOM, and I don't get it.
Well, it's partly because I think as an industry we can't do any better for turn-based. And so many of the other things about turn-based, if you can sort of embrace it, is super awesome. And so, that's where we're at.
Mm-hmm. I think what's very interesting, like in terms of like kind of like RNG versus not, is that when games have both set and random options. And what I mean by that is, if you remember from the game Mario plus Rabbids, the XCOM like with Mario and Luigi as sniping people, they made things very simple. If a character is staying on the open, 100% chance to hit. If they are behind, I think it's partial cover, I think it's a 50 to 75% chance to hit. And then they're behind full cover, I think it's like a 10% or even just a 0% chance. So it was very much, made very clear. Like, there was no such thing as, oh, you have a 22% chance, but if the guy is on high ground, it's now plus 3% chance, but if they're wearing fancy armor, they have a negative 10% reduction. It's all kept very clean. And then I just played the game Dungeon Encounters, which is like super minimalistic dungeon crawling RPG. And the thing that they do in the game is half the gear is all set values. This sword will do 1700 points of damage from now until the end of time. But then we have a class of weapons that it's completely random. So this pickaxe can do 10,000 points of damage, but it could roll anywhere from 0 to 10,000. So what weapon do you want to take in that regard? And I find that very interesting when you give the player that options of, again, as we were talking about earlier, with deterministic versus random choices.
Risk versus reward and high risk gameplay should be factored into the roguelikes as well for this, so that if you want to play, close to the sun, Icarus, you're allowed to, and that should really be a thing. So, if you want to use that mega weapon that when it actually hits destroys the universe, great, go for it. But you're gonna miss. You're gonna go down in flames a bunch of times.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and I think going back to the comment earlier, I think about Blood Bowl and about risk mitigation, that I think is a very important aspect when we talk about roguelike designs and how procedural and randomized content comes into play. Because if you keeping with XCOM, there are people, like, if you watch like expert level play of XCOM, they never get into a bad situation. Like, They'll know exactly what actions to take. They'll know exactly what are the most safest and still possible shots. Like they're never going to do Hail Mary plays. If you watch like a Grandmaster at XCOM who's trying to play on like legendary difficulty, their RNG is just the same as all of us. But it's about understanding, okay, maybe I shouldn't just keep doing those 20% chance shots. Yeah, it looks all cool and exciting, but maybe I should try something a little bit safer and not, put my guy right in the middle of the field and hope that they get that hit.
Well, there is streamer luck mode too, which
True.
if it detects you, it's broadcasting.
Yep.
That's the way to go. I've seen us mere mortals cannot comprehend what some of these people will do in an XCOM game. It's like, all right, you're killing people with pistols on Impossible. What the heck is going on here? What game are you playing?
How many hacks do you have?
Yeah. How many hacks are you running right now? But no, I mean, I think it is basically a known thing that no one will admit to, that the RNG in XCOM is borked. It's not real, but I think they did it on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
More tension. Somehow they have tension down to a science from a psychological level.
Yeah.
I mean, we've, in terminal conflict, we've got people that will occasionally come to us and say, okay, I don't think the random number generator is firing properly. It feels like I should have gotten this result. People don't understand probability and statistics well enough to make a claim like that without running it through, a million plus iterations.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really, your brain instantly goes, okay, well, I got mana screwed 6 times. Obviously, my deck is messed up in a card game, obviously. Someone mentioned the Magic the Gathering, so that's where my brain went. Our brains just aren't built to understand that, one, memory or randomness has no memory from one roll to another. It's still 50% each time. Doesn't mean that necessarily that you're going to hit if you miss the first time.
Yeah.
So, our wetware is horribly programmed to handle this type of situation. So the question I have is there a better way?
I think that's a very interesting question, and when we talk about kind of like the different degrees of RNG, I think again, like returning to a Slay the Spire or Monster Train where there is RNG, but there's a little bit more control of the player as to where it's going to go. I think that does a lot to alleviate that frustration. That yes, you still have the RNG of what cards are going to show up, but then you can then kind of, push your finger just a little bit on the scale and say, you know what? If I'm going a block-based heavy strategy with my Ironclad, maybe I'll take that Juggernaut card this time. Or maybe if it shows up, but let's say I'm running, very offensive mind strategy, it's not worth it this time. But the player has a little bit more of that sense of control. And I think that kind of goes with what Pony is talking about in chat about being able to weigh the options. That's not just, okay, here's a gun, or, you opened up the store, guy stabs you with a shiv, you die, restart the run. That you can choose, okay, do I want to risk opening up the store, and let's say there's a 30% I get stabbed, maybe there's a 50% chance that someone will hand me a box of chocolates, and I'll get my health back. Or maybe, the UPS guy will deliver me an ultra rare weapon. And I know what are the possible outcomes, but obviously I don't know which one I'm going to get when I open up the store, if I want to open up the store.
Well, back when this all first started, when we started seeing, the old roguelikes, it was all random.
Yeah.
When we did RPG games, it was all random. We randomized critical hit tables just from pinpricks to your neck snaps in half. Make up the context as you go. Weapons were completely randomized. Yeah, I remember the Temple of Apshai. Anybody remember that? Am I like the only one?
You're not.
It was like everything was just totally 100% random as far as loot goes. And now we've kind of built in what you were talking about, the pick one of a certain set. What is next? Because that can't be the final evolution. And I think there's a big staleness in roguelike or roguelite because of that.
Hmm.
Do you think this? Where do you think the staleness comes from?
We're all looking for similar synergies.
Hmm. So
You mean there's not as much cross-compatible kind of stuff, like diverse synergies that you're discovering?
Yeah, stuff that is even more organic than is kind of like what we're seeing now. And even just completely eliminating that model of the pick 3 cards, pick a certain class. Going outside of that, because every game is Slay the Spire at this point. When you distill it down to okay, you're playing cards, you've got 3 action points. The Slay the Spire map is driving me up a wall. I mean, it's in every game at this point. No one iterates on it.
Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's the shoot.
Benchmark.
What's the game that you were talking about that you were playing recently? The game that was on Netflix. That
Arcanum.
No, I mean the space game that has the same map
FTL?
as FTL. Yeah, it's the FTL map in a lot of ways too.
Yeah, or Star Fox.
Yeah.
Oh, true.
But no, I don't know if I agree that things are getting stale, but I think that Slay the Spire was good enough that it got people really excited, so they started to make some of the same kinds of things. There's a lot of games out there. It's just that, it's hard to make something new. And it's definitely hard to make something new when you don't have a crap load of resources to do it either. That said, a more sophisticated outlook on how to balance sort of deterministic and random is definitely a worthy thing to study. I think a great example of is Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. I feel like 5th edition they completely remade themselves in a much more sophisticated relationship of choices. And going back to granularity, there are harsh shifts. Like I think in the good old days, there was a little bit of a lack of understanding in how people work, right? And that it's not very interesting, actually, to have a 70% chance and then your upgrade is that you have a 75% chance. It's good for progression over a long period of time, but it's not a meaningful upgrade, right? It's too subtle. And at the same time, I can't double my chances of success every time. I guess we could have like a 0.005% chance, but then we run into obvious problems, right? And so sort of managing the actual results-based management of the experience and like a really like a careful study of how to sustain that and have progression, trick people into having the most possible sunk cost fallacies, all these things put pressure on us to invent.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think it would affect, say, Dungeons and Dragons or whatever game that has like a 75% hit chance sword if the upgrades were more like, this is always going to hit, but now you take an upgrade and it's like does a bit more damage, but you take 10% of the damage and the enemy takes 90%, or like you side grade it in these kind of different ways. It's like this is on fire now, but it's also going to set things in the environment on fire.
That's great.
I love side grades when it comes to like choices like this, because it does, again, it eliminates that infinite chase of like numbers and progression. Yes, this sword does 20 points, now it does 80 points, now it does 2 million points. It's all just swinging the same way. But I like when games give you that kind of flexibility where, okay, maybe now the sword will hurt you, but let's say every time it hurts you, you gain 10% more damage on your next swing. Because it opens up the door, I think, to a lot of these like Island of Misfit Toy strategies. I think we either talked about this on a previous roundtable, could be on another guest group. That idea that, yes, this skill may seem weird, and why the heck should I take something that's going to hurt me? But then what if we combine with this other skill that doesn't sound all that great? That every time you take damage, you recover health. So then all of a sudden, these two skills now turn into almost like permanent lifesteal on you. And the only way you'll be able to get to that is to have like those very like spiky choices that it becomes that puzzle of how do you figure it all out. So I think going back to what Seth was talking about with like a Slay the Spire and what we see with these kinds of games is that one of the issues is that the builds are in a way kind of figured out for you already. That if you're trying to do a poison build, a silent, you know what cards you need for that build to happen, just as you're going to do a block-based strategy. So even if there is RNG, even though you don't know what cards you're going to get, your overall goal has already been established before you even started your very first fight. But if you can make, these kinds of like more like, I guess like micro tactics come to light, it then becomes, I think, a little bit more interesting. Okay, this run I'm going to try a lightning debuff strategy combined with this fire slowness combined with a minion reflect build. And we'll just, roll the dice and see if we can even beat the boss with it.
Starting to see some original hybrid stuff coming out that's got me very interested. The guy who did Fuzz for Spook Squad, the designer there, is doing a game where you basically mold your spell as you're going. This is in prototype right now. About to go into early beta or alpha. Sorry. So you're playing the cards and you modify them on the fly with what's in your hand. I think that's a really interesting strategy, but I think it's still a little bit too random. Not random, but it's still a little bit too dependent on how many cards there are in the pool. Because there's only some. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think with some of these like synergy systems, an issue in thinking through them, like Binding of Isaac and games like Nova Drift as well, like where you're creating really intense weaponry. Often, it seems like what you're doing is just changing your damage output. Like you're just striving for a bigger, different damage output. And how do you make that interesting? Like it's really satisfying, but how do you make it interesting in this complicated, like kind of organic systems way, while still being within the scope of what you can do, and also what the players can comprehend.
Well, if the object is to kill, you'd have to give other win conditions other than killing something, so that you can sidestep from damage to, and even if you need 100 points to charm it, that's still damage.
I liked it, like with Monster Train in particular, that what they did with each of the factions was basically give each faction like its own unique mechanic. So the forest or the grass type one, they were the only faction that could use like thorns. So a lot of their damage was about reflecting it back on enemies. The Wick or the Candle Mafia, whatever it was, like they had their whole ability where like characters would die and then they would create these like little tokens that would do things, or they would like kind of have these like very special effects. So the idea was that each role or each class had damage, but that damage had its own unique rules and systems to it. I know I am blanking on it right now, but I know there have been quite a few either action roguelikes or even maybe other deck building roguelikes that have gone that route, where each character or class does something different. Like they have their own unique set of rules. I think Vol the Void would be an example. We could have gotten Josh on. He could certainly elaborate more on that, about how each character has like 2 or 3 different builds, and those builds have completely different rule sets to how they work in the game.
Well, some people are gonna say, well, that's too limiting. I want to play the monk with a poison build, or I want to play the monk with a quick attack build instead of the building up of attacks the monk does. And that is so satisfying when you build up 30 combos on and watching them all go off in the next turn. But Vault of the Void actually got a lot of people saying that they didn't like that they were so constrained to those builds. And I don't agree with that. I think it's great. I actually like that a little bit better. Give me some purpose instead of just everything is an open synergy that's going to be, I watched Northern Lion play various roguelikes. And I don't know how he pulls these synergies out of his butt. It's like, oh, I'm going to go for this type of build. And he does. I never get the right things to get that sequencing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if I'm playing like something like Ring of Pain where I can reroll, I still never get the right stuff.
Yeah.
I think as the item pool increases also it's more difficult to, as we add content, it's more difficult to, and we've reached basically critical mass where I have been thinking about how do you give players more control over what they can receive or want to receive.
Yeah, and that was a problem that I had with this game. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one here who played this one. It was called, I think, Gloom. This was like a 2D kind of like a action roguelike. It was like very Lovecraftian theme. I really enjoyed the game. It had like a lot of really good like imagery and themes to it. But the problem was that there were very few ways to regain your health. So any weapon or any artifact that gave you even the remotest of lifesteal was huge. And of course, it meant that for a lot of runs, you really had to get like few very specific weapons or items to drop, or there's just no real way you're going to be able to beat that game. As a very interesting point, it had an achievement challenge, beat the game in under 10 minutes, and like it's next to impossible because you basically have to rely all on RNG. Like, even if you are the ultimate player at that game, you would never be able to stack enough damage and bonuses on your own merit to complete that challenge. I tried it several times on stream. I think my record was like 12 to 13 minutes of trying to get through that game.
What slows it down? Is it just needing to churn through more content?
Like the enemies are able to. You have a stamina bar for one thing, so you have to manage how fast you can attack, which means that stronger hits means fewer stamina needed. And then the later bosses get like very like bullet hell. Okay, the boss just like lifts his hand up and like things just start raining down from the sky. So I hope you have enough dodge to avoid it all, or you're going to take every single hit, because I don't think there was any iframes in that game.
So I think something we need to keep in mind too is like some of this just plays into overall kind of results logic, right? So if you're going to make a game whose results are extremely kind of coarse, right, that there is success and there is failure, and you're going to have a string of those. Now, subtle RNG differences are going to matter quite a bit. Now, if this game was also combined with failing any one of those die rolls is kind of a harsh end, and that the game somehow successfully like builds up all this sunk cost and this feeling that you're making progress and then just takes it all away, it's going to be very hard for that game to, especially people who are maybe vulnerable to being enraged by bad RNG, they aren't going to like that game. And there's nothing you could, there's no way to make that game likable to that person. And maybe that a game that kind of harsh and disciplined isn't interesting to a large percentage of the people. Like, I think if we kind of turn the conversation around and think about our players out there and the way they're divided up into groups, I think you'll find that there's a big fat chunk in the middle that's kind of like, that felt bad, but I don't care. But of course, we don't hear from them.
No, you don't. That reminds me of that the GC talk with Darkest Dungeon. They show like the streamer who like,
I love it.
Yes.
Hey, this guy, he missed every possible roll, and they just like picked up and broke his keyboard right there. My chat would love it if I did that on stream, right?
Well, the
It's
original.
interesting the difference between turn-based and action as well. When in an action game, people have they can they can feel partly responsible for not doing something at the right time. But in turn-based, it's like it's the game's fault.
Yeah.
Totally.
In the early days of wargaming, you would determine your chances of success at any given battle based on a combat results table that basically you factored in all the attacking values, you compared it against all the defensive values, and you got a 1-to-1, a 2-to-1. And usually it went from 4-to-1 to 1-to-4.
Generally, yeah. And
that was like at the early days of things. And people learned quickly never to do 1-to-4 attacks.
Unless you're desperate.
Yeah, unless you're
desperate. You're like, this unit's dead next turn, so okay, fine. Those are the only dramatic moments in those games.
Yeah.
Not to say I love those. I mean, well, the history of tabletop wargaming is itself kind of like a fun topic, but that results table has been used by thousands of war games.
Sure. And how many tables have been flipped because of a bad roll? I remember there's this one game, Victory in the Pacific, which I love the game, and it's very, very D6 oriented. So you would get to the Battle of Pearl Harbor, and you'd have like 50 attacking dice to throw at the battleships on Battleship Row, and a 5 and a 6 were with a 4 and a 5 were a hit, a 6 was a critical hit, and each ship could take a certain amount of hits. If that battle went badly for the Japanese, they were sunk, no pun intended. So you'd get to that point, you'd throw out your 472 dice, and if it didn't go your way, you flip the table. These were realistic strategies back in the 80s, but haven't really come that far.
It's funny because rolling a lot of dice feels fun. And a game I worked on previously, that was one of the kind of premises for designing the combat. You just want to accrue a lot of dice and roll them all, but yeah, you can have. It's just so extremely random.
It's funny too, because I think part of what makes that so enjoyable is that you rolled the dice. So somehow you feel connected to that number, right? But until you parse all the dice, it's hidden information.
Yeah, it's just a big tactile experience. You're holding the big number that you want.
And there is a very small mini game actually in parsing large numbers of dice that I'm sure people have at least loosely learned playing Risk all the way to its conclusion, where you rapidly sort them into similar numbers to then in round numbers to try to add it up quicker.
As a quick time check, we are 3 minutes after 9, so we have about another 17 minutes or so. Give or take. I'm trying to think if there's any other major points. I guess one thing that I want to ask, and then I think this will be my final point to throw to the group, and I'll give it to everyone else. One thing that was brought up earlier, I think Pony was talking about with Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone. And one of the things I found very interesting about these kinds of games, like deck builders, which are normally designed to be very deterministic once you get the card in your hand, is when they introduce cards that have RNG associated to them. This card will do between 1 and 7 points of damage. Or one of the things I remember a lot of people were upset about when they introduced them in Gwent was the idea of having cards that you play this card, it will randomly give you another card of a specific type. Let's say it will give you a random spell or a random monster. And up until that point, Gwent was a game that was very deterministic in its approach. You can only play one card a turn. That card's kind of what it does is absolute. And I always found that very interesting about trying to throw RNG into something that's already kind of deterministic. I kind of want to see what the group thinks about that.
That example is quite interesting because Hearthstone, I stopped playing for a couple of years and then went back and tried again. And it's really, really ramped up the cards generate more cards aspect. Turn to turn, you're constantly generating more cards. And it's, I guess, giving people more agency over what they need at that time. and it also sort of speaks to what I have never really enjoyed about constructed gameplay and deck builders. I always play draft. Like, I really love draft, which is the way more random one, I suppose, but you get more interesting results, I feel, and it's not like, you know what Seth was saying earlier, where you're going for a specific build that you know is there, and you're going up against a specific build that you know exists. It's like an example of where the randomness really facilitates the experience, I feel, for me at least. Like, I don't want to know what I'm up against. I just want to be playing the best that I can with what I've got.
Don't ever tell me the odds.
That kind of an experience, right, is a little bit at odds with probably how most people play Magic the Gathering, for example. And it's a really interesting, like, for players that get to that point where what they're really looking for is they love the rules of the system and they want to be thrown into an environment where they have to challenge their rules. And the only way to do that in sort of a turn-based, semi-deterministic environment is that you have to devise a sequence from a field of possibilities, which requires a decent amount of intelligence, right? So for early or newcomers to that kind of a space, it can be overwhelming or difficult. And very few games are sort of built with it in mind, getting a player into like kind of that mind space. But I think that like I really agree with what you're saying there. It's kind of something that's kind of sort of put me off for a long time with card battlers, is that they're so fixated on kind of like I need to get like 1,000 matches in so that I know the ropes and understand all the builds that are out there, and I can't just use, and you know, maybe I'm too full of myself in this, I can't just use how smart I am and navigate the space against others. I'm just at this information deficit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's just so much knowledge. Oh, go on.
Yeah. The people that create the high level play decks in the meta, it takes a special type of person to do that. And you know, I would say 70% of the players are not touching the meta. They're playing lower quality decks and having more fun with it.
Are you sure it's not 99%?
I wanted to be. I wasn't. I'm not sure of the number at all, but I would imagine a lot of people just net deck, and so in that case, they're playing the meta. They're not building the meta, but they're playing it.
And they're changing the meta at the same time as other people see that that's the meta now, and then time to counter it.
Yeah, I have my developer meta for how to kind of divide up a user base. Is that there's this sub 1% that are just, they commit so much time that they know all the rules, and as a side effect, they're at the bleeding edge. They understand it better than the developers even do, probably. And then there's the next set, which is like, you know, a relatively small percentage. It might be 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, but they are avid players. They put a crap load of time into the game, and they know the world's opinions about what the right decks are, and they keep up with that stuff, right? And those players are outrageously difficult to beat. And then there's a big chunk below that they're avid players, and they don't read the internet. And they don't know what the meta is, but they do have a lot of pet things that they love, that they feel are very effective. They just don't know all the other things that are effective. And then, of course, there are all the other players which are like on their way to either stop playing or becoming a higher level player.
And I think I'm with Simon that I like it when it is about, okay, I know the rules, I know the mechanics, just let me get out of the meta. Let me just mess around with things. Give me that. As I said earlier, I love the Island of Misfit Toys kind of strategy or motif for a lot of games. Because again, there's always that temptation that, okay, if, you know, card C, L, and M are always the best cards to take, then, you know, those three cards have already been decided for me. But then once those three cards have been decided, well, now I need the cards that go with that one. And then we just kind of get that solidified meta. And it is, I think, that issue for a lot of these games about how do you keep the game from being like stuck like that? And if we get on a discussion about meta, we'll be here for probably another 2 to 3 hours easily.
Yes, and which is actually surprisingly not related to random.
Mm-hmm.
Coming soon.
Yeah.
Collectible card game cast.
Well, that's good. I need those notes for my next book. So yeah, let's do that one.
Well, and I do think the topic of how user bases have almost across the board for any kind of game where it's possible become a community of chasing the meta. I think that's a really important thing to know and understand and dig into why and have your theories about how you can diverge from that path, how you, like, if you don't think, we're now already having that conversation, I'll just back off.
Yeah.
We'll get to it.
Eventually, yeah.
I had an interesting thing, and maybe this is kind of too long for this podcast. But what about making the curve of good results and bad results flatter? That's flattening the curve based on player performance. I alluded to it before, but what if single player games had ELO systems in it that pretty much ranked you based on your play and what you were able to do through a series of trial games or whatever, or as you played, and would react to your runs? If you were having a more difficult time, it would lighten up on you. If you were having a harder, an easier time, it would cramp down on you. But not doing it unfairly. Just
the only risk with that is the psychological response from some of the players who like I don't know, maybe they're too into libertarianism or something, but like the moment they realize you're taking care of them, now they're angry.
I'm not saying taking care of them. I'm saying to give them a better challenge.
That's how they interpret it, right? They'll interpret a dynamic reduction in difficulty as, oh, you think I'm a baby.
This is one of the... I saw these graphs of different balancing styles for games, and particularly roguelikes a while ago. I can't remember. It was on Twitter somewhere, but yeah, that is one style of when you scale the difficulty to the player, it results in the player getting bored faster because you want the challenge and you also want the extremes of the experience. Like you want to be able to snowball and steamroll. You want to build to a place where it gets easier, but then the games will often like stagger add the ascension mechanics to cater for difference in skills so they can experience the being strong and then being out of their depth. And there were a couple other progression modes that were interesting, but not many roguelikes used the one which adjusts the difficulty to the player skill.
Yeah, like
although a story-rich game, I think, could benefit quite a bit from something like that.
Yeah. If you want to get people through a story, if that's the main experience, for sure. If the experience is mastery, maybe not.
And the dynamic difficulty actually, I think, needs to itself be dynamic. Because for more dramatic, like this is something I've actually talked a lot about is on the team for Epic Tavern, where we have the conversation about plot armor. And so for uninteresting things, you should not unluckily die. Right? Then it's like, this just doesn't feel right. It's a weird thought, but it's so true for our heads.
And to Seth's point about having like a single player ELO system, I've seen that there's only 2 examples that come in my mind of games that have done something similar to that. I know they had a something like that in, I think it was either The Witcher 2 or The Witcher 3, that they introduced as kind of like, before you actually start the game, we're going to put you into this like little battle arena, and how well you fight will kind of give us a recommendation of what difficulty you should play as. I think this could have been in the Enhanced Edition. I don't think it was in the base game. And for anyone who remembers Enter the Matrix, way back, the one good Matrix video game, they did something just like that, where before you start playing, they put you in this fight. Like, okay, fight these common soldiers. Now fight the military. Now fight 10 agents. Did you beat all 10 agents? Well, you're Neo. Play the game on the highest difficulty and go for it.
Enter the Matrix was also the second best Matrix movie.
I thought the MMO was pretty good.
There was a Matrix.
Do you think this
MMO?
is similar to?
Oh yeah.
Didn't Obsidian scale Elder Scrolls 4 scale difficulty of creatures to the player? Is that effectively
I think
the
Skyrim
same?
did too as well.
Yeah, but that's not adjusting to player performance. That's simply that
To play
all my content is always valid for you at all times. So you can't lose going back to old zones and just dusting things and going into a new zone and having it be much, much more difficult. But what you gain is the whole of the environment is functional at all times. It's an interesting trade-off, and obviously a little sometimes it's a controversial conversation, although I don't think it has to be.
Yeah, I as a complete tangent about that, I really like what they do with Guild Wars 2, with their whole scaling system, that you scale down to the environment of what you're in, but then the rewards you get scale up to your current level. So the content was always relevant to you progress-wise. You can never out-level an area.
Didn't stick around Guild Wars 2 that long.
Let's see. Yeah, and again, I think to Pony's comment, I think it's the same about me when it comes to scaling content. That about it doesn't feel like you're playing the real game, and that is another 2 to 3 hour conversation. What is the real game when you have difficulty levels and settings like that? But we have about another 4 to 5 minutes, so I could rant and rave about this topic for hours to come. So I will throw it to you guys. Anyone have any questions you want to ask us or thoughts on the topic?
Hey, a final point to what you're saying, though, is there is a separate form of dynamic adjustment against probabilistic results that is probably worth mentioning, that isn't adjusting to performance, rather simply streak dampening. So, for every consecutive failure, reduce that chance of failure a bit, especially in the context of loot. And we've seen this work, the amount of complaints about loot in World of Warcraft players went down quite a bit after bad streak protection came into being. And now, granted, people will still get unlucky even if you're reducing it, and they're not going to be happy. But if you go from 1% of 10 million people down to 0.1% of 10 million people, that's very worth it.
System Allies, the computer version, actually has a few different models of streak dampening, or not making the game harder per se, but making the random results more or less out there.
Normalizing a bit, right?
Yeah, normalizing. Thank you. That's a better.
And I
thought was really interesting for a hardcore, not a hardcore war game, but a war game to be doing that.
Yeah, definitely. You're not allowed to say that Axis and Allies is hardcore.
Yeah, it's not a hardcore war game. It's like Risk with a little more rules. But
for the wargaming stream, we should talk about games that have a hidden sort of story. Like Axis and Allies sort of needs to be determined on its first turn in a lot of ways.
All right. Any other questions or topics from anyone else? Okay.
I think we pretty much covered a lot of stuff with RNG.
Yeah. Although, okay, one final thing then related to the thing I just said. For loot, obviously, it makes sense so that people, especially if they're looking for a particular result, right? Especially they read about that you kill this particular boss in Grim Dawn and they drop this particular item and you do it over and over again and it never happens or something and you're real sad. But I think it also can be put into place for enhancing the drama of the experience. So,
attention.
Let's say it's like Dungeons and Dragons again, right? You do 3 death rolls and you die. So, first couple times it happens when you're playing in the campaign mode. The 3rd death roll, it doesn't happen. So that you just feel like you've been saved, and then it's like, oh, I've tempted fate enough times, and finally it didn't work out. And even though every individual, if they were to cross notes, are like, oh, it's funny, it happens exactly the same way for all of us. They're never going to do that. Instead, they're just going to sort of remember the feature more fondly.
I like the similar sort of that one was I think it was like Curse of the Dead Gods or Curse of the Mad Gods, the kind of like Hades like action roguelike that came out I think like right around the same time. Where
Dead.
Yeah, Dead Gods.
Dead, thank you. Where you have like your curse build up, and every time it hits 100, you get a new debuff. But you can do things that can specifically either raise or lower the amount of curse you get. You always have that push of, okay, maybe I'll take another 20% curse for maybe this better weapon. Surely I'll be able to mitigate that at some point. How bad could that, 4th curse be, really? I mean, my run's going so well. What could possibly go wrong?
I just want to put in mutation effects into that game. So that you build up enough curse, you actually get positive effects as well.
I think it has some weapons that give you positive related effects from curse. I'm pretty sure there's like a whole bunch of purple weapons.
Never use those, and that could definitely be like another topic about how can you make bad choices worth it to take without it either breaking the game or just frustrating the hell out of the player.
Yeah, because there's still a lot of randomness in whether you actually get those items during the run.
Yeah.
So
but there's a lot of items in rogues where you do thousands of points of damage, but you only have 1 hit point. You see that a lot. That's a big crutch I do see.
I cannot do hitless runs in any game.
I think I'll just quickly touch on another issue that game potentially has with RNG, which Dead Cells also has, is the more stuff you unlock, the more randomness you have. I mean, we kind of talked about it earlier, but particularly with this, like if you want to experience those cursed weapons, you probably want a clean save that just unlocks the cursed weapons.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to like as a one final how many final points are up to this point, to what Seth was talking about earlier with kind of making this more interesting. The problem when you throw in so many items is that not only does it become that much harder, but then if you give the player the ability to control that, it kind of I think ruins that mystique of this item that has a 9% chance of killing me, 10% chance of doing something good. Why the heck would I ever want to put that into my possible pool of items when, I can take this other item that's like 8% of the chance that it's always great and 20% chance it's just good. And again, goes back to, I think it always ends up with that issue of mitigation. And what can the player do? Like, ultimately, I think, and this will be, I guess, my final grand thought, that from a player perspective, the player always wants to mitigate risks. They want to be able to do stuff that they can control. And RNG, as we all know, is inherently uncontrollable. And part of that challenge from a player perspective is trying to balance these two chaotic forces. To go back to what Tomo said, that a lot of people don't understand or comprehend that weight when it comes to RNG. And from a design standpoint, it just becomes a very hard to balance of stuff. Because to Simon's question back at the start regarding like making like a 10% chance to succeed, 9% chance to fail interesting, a lot of people will just don't want to take that chance, even if it is the only option. Because again, 90% chance I'm going to get something bad, I'll take my anything at least like 11% chance better than that. And it is hard to balance all this stuff out. And again, like I'm holding back, much like Tomo, some of my questions or thoughts because we'll be here for another day or two.
Yeah, all these casts we can probably do for like 3 hours if we wanted to. Easily. Heck, I get on a stream with Tomo and we're there for 4 hours.
So I think that's it for Tomo and I. I think does Seth or you, Simon, do you have any final points, final topics?
Oh no, I think pretty well covered for now. Yeah.
Excited to see what happens next. I think there's a lot of room for innovation in roguelikes and roguelikes at this stage of the game. And I'd like to see what that becomes. Especially with AI generated systems being able to be put into things realistically now. I saw some AI generated artwork in a game environment where it was pulling all the art assets from one of the Wally systems or whatever it is, and that was some really interesting stuff. And I'd like to see how GP3 works into this. But that's just me and my crazy AI machinations.
Oh, I love the idea. We've been thinking about it for Epic Tavern, even though we know there's some controversy wrapped around it. It's just so interesting.
Yeah, and talking about like the future of roguelikes, that's definitely another potential topic, I think, for a future discussion. So I
We
think
can pie in the sky on that and be there for years.
yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think with that, let us wrap things up before we get on like 20 more final tangents. And I'm sure RNG will factor into another topic at some point, especially for this group. So as a customary for these discussions, I'm going to give everyone a chance to kind of go around the table. Any social media, work you want to talk about, the floor will be yours. So again, we'll start with me and go around. Again, if you're watching this and you are new, do the liking, subscribing, and commenting. There are information about my Twitter, Discord, and Patreon over there, as well as down below. Be sure to join the Discord if you'd like to hang out with us, and if you want to pitch future topics. So I'll send over to Tomo.
You can we stream development a couple times a week now at our Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Epic Tavern, and there was a little bit of a break for our dev chats in these last few months, but they'll be starting back up again. And so we also meet at our Discord channel, discord.gg/Epic Tavern, to talk about all things RPG, storytelling, game design, game industry, and Epic Tavern related. Thanks for having me, by the way. This was good.
All right. Seth?
You guys might, you guys being them, might also know me as the Strategy Informer. I run a project that does reviews, previews, tells people about great strategy games, or at least what we feel are great strategy games. Got a little bit of a team. We've got a Discord. We've got a website. The links will be down below. And I've also got my game design stuff, and I'm doing PR and marketing and design for Strategy Mill, and some playtesting and consulting for a few other places. Again, links below.
Yeah, if you want to see what I'm up to or just keep in touch, I'm on Twitter at sboxle, SBOXLE, that is. Or, we run our dev and game Discord, discord.gg/Ring of Pain. So thanks for having me on the podcast.
All right, yeah, it was great hanging with everyone this evening. Hopefully for next time we get all the time zones in alignment, and we get Josh on and talk about Vault of the Void and whatever other roguelike related topic we'll have next time. So for everyone, thanks again for tuning in. We'll be back whenever we can get these time zones aligned, and we'll have other roundtables and discussions, of course, planned for the future. For those of you watching this live right now, come back later tonight for our indie game night stream and for our regular streams here on Game Wisdom. So with that said, everyone, have a great rest of your evening. To the roundtable again, thanks for coming out, and we will talk to everyone again real soon. Take care, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Cheers. See ya.